I'd like to begin from the introductions of our panelists. You already were introduced to Professor Keen, to Dr. Yurchenko. So I'd like to introduce the rest of the panelists, and they are as follow: Dr. Janina Petelczyc from Warsaw School of Economics. I think this is the name. She's dealing with political economy and questions about workers' movements, social rights, and this kind of topics. Then Katarzyna Szwarc, whose position is very mouthful, so but let me start. She's a high representative of the Minister of Finance, Polish Minister of Finance, for Capital Market Development Strategy. And she's also keenly interested, keenly is a pun intended, Professor Keen, in green finance. And the last of the panelists is Director Piotr Arak. He's a director of Polish Economic Institute. And recently published a well-received book on the political economy consequences of the pandemics called Pandenomics. So welcome to all of our panelists, and I'd like to briefly introduce the topic. It's called The End of Neoliberal History, and I'd like to start from a quote. I could use a quote from Milton Friedman, but I will not. I will use a quote from Keynes. It's ideas, not vested interests that are dangerous for good and evil. And I'd like to talk about the ideas for the future if we agree, and both Professor Keen and Dr. Yurchenko argued very, very forcefully that we can agree that the neoliberal history has to finish. So what is next? What are the ideas for change? And I'd like to divide the discussion in two questions. One will be dealing with the short-run problems, which are connected to the COVID, the current global inflation and current global problems with supply chains, and of course the war in Ukraine. And the second one, I would like to be focusing on something more far ahead, if we live long enough, of course. But I believe that we can all agree that we are striving to find ideas that will help us do it. So as for the first question, I will ask you alphabetically with Professor Keen and Professor Yurchenko in the end, okay? Because you have already introduced the main topic of the panel, I think. So you will be able to respond to the rest of the panelists. So if we go alphabetically, I ask you to be as brief as possible, not more than 5 minutes. Let's start with Piotr Arak, and the question is: thinking short term, considering a series of already unfolding economic challenges following last couple of rough years, which have seen rising inequality and debt levels, both private and public, with chronic shortages of key resources resulting in high inflation levels worldwide, what is the appropriate direction of public policy, especially the fiscal one?
Okay. Thank you. So it remembers me of school. Always been the first, so always has to answer. I had to answer the most difficult questions at the beginning, so that everybody else had the chance to think about the correct answer actually and remember what was in the textbook or whatever. But that's my life. Yeah, I wanted to answer your question, but actually I thought about one of the issues that I wanted you all to go home with before answering the, probably very difficult question about the policy mix for the next couple of years and the debate within the European Union, the United States, the roasting of central bankers across the globe that they didn't see the inflation coming. First thing I wanted to say is that for a thriving Ukraine, what we can do as the European Union and the United States, Canada, Australia as well, and other countries is what some of the members of the European Union, also the Polish government and the Polish representatives and Polish diplomats argue for, is to seize the Russian assets of the central bank. So the bonds owned by countries as the United States directly and indirectly, also German, French, probably some of them even might be Polish, but using these assets as leverage and as well as a kind of trust fund for the redevelopment and regeneration of Ukraine after the war. We need that money, Ukraine needs that money, and for various of reasons, I don't know why governments cannot agree on doing that. So there was one case that the United States agreed to do that, and that was the Afghanistan and the Taliban regime. Previously, it was mainly dictators who did seize assets previously. In previous wars and situations like this, but we have we're one click away of creating a trust fund for Ukraine that could be advised, could be used for the development of this country, and I truly believe that we have this possibility, and also in terms of influencing the Russian government more. And we seized approximately 100 billion euros of the assets owned by the Russian central banks. That's a 1/3 of the officially assets that we should have seized or frozen by different authorities within the European Union and the United States, because the 2/3 are difficult to be found. They are owned by subsidiaries and subsidiary banks across the globe, Southeast Asia and Africa as well. So, but the 1/3 we can find and we can use. So this is one remark that I want you to think about. And if you talk about Russian aggression, think about Ukraine. This is one argument that you can bring up. This is an economic argument. It's not a military one, and it's quite easy to be done. It just needs political will. And now I have 1 minute and 15 seconds, so I can answer your question. I guess the one issue that I wanted you to leave before everybody else starts to discuss the same thing is there's a big difference between the economies, especially because of the war, because of the different assets owned by the central banks, as the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve. Poland, for example, is also bordering with Ukraine. It's influenced indirectly by war, increasing the cost of repaying our debt, increasing also the interest rates and making the Polish zloty weaker because of the war that is happening on. This also has an influence on the Polish monetary policy and also on fiscal policy as well, in terms of how we can repay the debt that is owned by our country. And not everything that the United States or the European Central Bank does can a country like this do. And this is something I want to end my remark because I had exactly 5 minutes, which end up right now.
Actually, from my perspective, you've used 4, but maybe there's the difference between the timers that we use. Okay, but
my iPhone says differently, so I know. Okay, I can use 1 minute more. Okay, if I have time.
No. No, but thank you for introducing the most pressing issue, which is the war in Ukraine and the redevelopment that we have to think about. The second speaker will be Dr. Janina Petelczyc.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like first thank the Polish Economics Network for your job and that you have gone through this window of opportunity and you are appearing in the mainstream media in Poland because you are really changing this discourse, and I'm very happy that I can be a part of that today, so thank you very much for the invitation. I will not exactly answer to the question about the fiscal policy because my field of expertise is social security and pensions, and it's also very difficult to answer to this question in short term because it's always long term. But I think that we can all agree that social security is not the fiscal policy itself, but influence very strongly the fiscal sustainability and is very often considered as a burden. When we discuss the social security, it's always, oh, we spend 11% of GDP on pensions, for example, in Poland. But we forget about the fact that social security also accomplishes a fiscal goal, which is redistribution, and I would like to focus on that. And of course, it depends on how we see and how we consider redistribution and in what type of welfare capitalism we are living in. So we've been looking through the social security and pension through this neoclassical lens that you've been talking about. We are living in our part of the world in aging societies. There is a declining growth rates and growing public debts that made pension reform salient issue in political reforms. And what kind of reforms we had? It was the reduction of public pension pillar, expansion of non-state capital-funded pensions, which are part of financialization and privatization of pensions, and also very important shift in our part of the world from defined benefit, which guarantee the pension in relation to the previous wage at retirement, into defined contribution that offers only what we have paid, and what is also very important, reallocate the retirement risk onto individuals. So even though during economic crisis in almost all OECD countries the pension funds lost massively, there is no reversal in these official policies of financialization and no general trends toward growing public pensions. So I think we should ask ourselves, what kind of redistribution do we want? What are our values in here social policy more than fiscal, of course, and at what cost? Economic and social, but social cost at the end of the day are also economic cost. And I would say that we should start to think about pension in the other way. We should think about pension coverage in our countries and in the world globally. We should think about inequality, especially gender, but also other fields of inequality in pensions, and enforce public pillar, which is not very popular right now, and cover the whole society with social security. I mean, people, regardless the type of contract, situation on the labor market, gender, ethnicity, and many other. So I would say that, of course, financialization is a fact in our post-industrial societies. So the challenge is, from the one side, to change this discourse toward more public pension and probably other public social and economic policies, but also the challenge is to work toward better governance also of that what is already privatized, and to minimize the exposure for the individuals and ensure proper supervision of pension funds. And we probably will discuss it later on, but I think that this is also the opportunity that we can use this huge capital toward redirect it and use it towards more sustainable and more pro-social investment. So thank you very much.
Thank you again, very disciplined speaker. This is highly appreciated. This is a very important topic that you raised, that the social help that we provide to, for example, senior citizens is in the end economic. I would reverse it and say that like the economy should be in the service of the social sphere and not the other way around. But I think we agree. Next speaker would be Katarzyna Szwarc.
Thank you for the invitation to the panel. And I just had this thought, never in my life have I thought that I would be sitting on a panel with prominent academics representing the Ministry of Finance and discussing the end of neoliberalism. So I think if you're asking yourself, where are we already in the mainstream, I think we're quite close. So Piotr has kindly touched upon some geopolitical aspects of the fiscal policy debate, and let me then focus on more economic ones, because indeed, from our perspective, the current situation poses a serious challenge. We do note the rising inflation, and as the Ministry of Finance, we face enormous pressure to act, to use all the instruments we have at hand to curtail it. And this would, of course, include budget tightening, radically cutting public investment, public spending, and social spending. But on the other hand, we are more than aware of the effects that such interventions would have on the future and current economic development of our labor market that needs to accommodate guests from Ukraine, who are here already, but some of them at least may decide to make Poland their new home, and we need to be able to absorb that new labor supply. Such interventions would also severely impact the well-being of most vulnerable citizens. And of course, it's easy to advocate the tightening of the belt if it's not on your own waist. The challenge is thus finding the right balance between not facilitating inflation on the one hand with our fiscal policy interventions, but on the other hand, not doing it at the expense of people who can simply not afford another wave of shock therapy. This does not only, of course, include individuals, but we're also talking smaller and medium cap companies who are an important source of income of those individuals. So our response to that challenge is currently twofold. First of all, significantly increasing productivity with new investment. We know that the current inflationary pressures are at least partly due to supply shortages. So, in other words, let's try to meet those supply demands with the means we already have at hand. And within that context, we're really looking forward to starting the implementation of the Polish recovery plan. Importantly, investment does not only, or facilitating investment does not only have to mean throwing more money on the market. We can also achieve that through smart regulatory changes, and by this I mean, for example, making it easier to put on renewable energy installations, or making it easier to create energy cooperatives. So stuff like that can really change the equation. Secondly, it's protecting the vulnerable, of course. So spending, the rule we take is that spending cannot, the cut of spending cannot be at the expense of people working, the workers on the minimum wage, or people who struggle to heat their homes. So we do, in other words, we do understand, and we do need to brace ourselves for more difficult economic period. But the goal is here for those who advocate tightening the budget and the belt to have their fair share in that tightening. And this is what our fiscal policies are currently focusing on. And happy to discuss the details of that.
Thank you very much. It's nice to hear such words from a representative of Ministry of Finance, which is traditionally in Poland pretty conservative. But anyway, don't be afraid to loosen the belt when the time comes of the recession. So this is important thing to remember. And now for our keynote speakers who will have a little bit of time to respond to the discussion that was unfolding. Maybe we can start with Yulia. Is it all right?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to try to be brief because we've already taken time to speak, but I'll make a couple of comments responding to what has been raised. So I think what we need, generally, I'm quite fond of studying what is the state, what do we understand by it, and the way I conceptualize it, I develop it from Robert Cox and the whole kind of Gramscian thing, that we need to be thinking about states as not some sort of nation-states units, but rather state-society capital complexes and the power balance in those complexes. Because once we understand what happens between those three in each specific nation-state, we can start understanding where all the problems are starting to come from. And that, of course, needs to be understood in the global context of division of labor and power relations in the world economy. So, for example, Ukraine has borderline zero policy-making sovereignty, and in a Marxist sense, has it diluted its sovereignty because it's so heavily indebted. It has very little capacity, even if the most well-meaning people come to power, to decide what to do with that money and how to execute certain policies. And that kind of that erosion of sovereignty that happens through indebtedness paralyzes governments, paralyzes ministries, paralyzes societies, and that is something that needs to go away. And that's also one of the really important reasons as to why foreign debt needs to be cancelled, and also that why debt should never be used as a tool of geopolitical control. And that is, you know, I'm not going to divulge into that too much, but the fundamental rebalancing of power in state-society capital complexes needs to happen. We need to minimize the role of influence of the global oligarchy on decision-making in concrete states. It doesn't mean that there is no space for business, but what it does mean is that gamblers shouldn't decide the destinies of countries. So we need more regulation, we need stricter controls, internalizing what some call environmental externalities, but also internalizing positive externalities, not just negative ones. Because when we start understanding that investment in public services, investment in education, in healthcare, in public transport is not simply expenditure in the equation, but it's also an investment. When that internalization happens, we start seeing government spending differently. We start seeing that actually having an educated workforce, having clean rivers and forests, having properly functioning healthcare system is a benefit. Even if we cannot very clearly quantify, there are ways of quantifying it to some extent, but we need to start thinking about these different categories differently. You know, having trust funds, I think what the first speaker was talking about, like having trust funds set up for Ukraine, for example, in other countries that are struggling, or there is a whole line of them, a whole range of them, and there are also groups in every specific country, including richer, so to speak, countries. There are classes and stratas who are really suffering. I live in the UK, and there are millions of children living in poverty and going to food banks there. This is the reality of everyday life now. But what we need to be talking about is that we shouldn't be prioritizing compensating debt holders, but rather we need to be thinking about reorganizing, rethinking how financing works, and not least kind of seeing that investment, for example, in resilient infrastructure is something that helps everyone. I cannot, for example, drink tap water in Ukraine, and I'm glad that we can do it in Poland, because water infrastructure, water utilities have been underfunded for years. And so they use too much chlorine to make sure that water is safe to drink, but that means that you have to boil it to let it sit. And that means that people rely on plastic. That means that there is energy being used. So there is, for example, investing in revamping that infrastructure. You have your jobs, you have better health, you have cleaner environment, you have less pollutants all over the place, you have less lorries, trucks carrying water bottles around. There are millions of examples of where state investment of the developmental state can go, because when you use state finances, and I agree, just throwing money wherever is not a good idea either. So it needs to be clever investment, right? It needs to be clever investment, and that cannot be left to the markets to decide, because markets go, whatever market is, private investors go where profits are to be made, in a very short term. And we're talking about fast profits and short timelines. So it needs to be done coordinated. It needs to be done through the state. So I'm advocating for developmental states and dismantling of TRIPS regime, because that is crippling economies.
Before I give the floor to you, I'd like to add to that not only external debt is very creating dependency, but also foreign investment. So this is an important stuff to remember, and we in Poland are struggling with being to some extent hostage to external capital, not only debt and portfolio one, but also like the productive capital.
Absolutely.
So let's hear what Steve has to say.
I'm very pleased to hear the opening statement that the Minister of Finance presented, but it is true. Pardon me. I was very happy to hear that statement from you as the Ministry finding yourself on a stage talking about the end of neoliberalism. I take it's quite a strange situation. What I want you all to imagine is, what would the world be like if neoliberalism had actually worked? Okay? Because what we were promised, if you go back to when Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were saying we should get rid of the state, et cetera, and get the government out of people's lives and so on, the vision they had was that the market would provide everything, okay, successfully. So you could take away social security. People wouldn't need it. They'd be earning enough money from their wages. You could take away public health because you could afford to pay for it at a hospital, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a vision of an incredibly successful market economy where taking away what the state did would not matter, would make people better off. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? Okay? Instead, we're in a catastrophe where people have had their social security taken away and now they're homeless instead, where diseases are spreading because we don't have sufficient public health, where there's a breakdown in the education system because we have moronic resources provided to universities and schools, and we wonder why people are finding appeal in ancient religions and QAnon and nonsense like that. So what we are experiencing is not what the dream we were given, but the nightmare, okay? The nightmare's come true. And now we're told, why don't you guys fix it? Okay? So with the situation that critics like myself are now inheriting, and Yulia as well, and anybody who's opposed this for their professional career, we are now being brought into a situation of a total catastrophe, that if the neoliberalism would be right, it would actually be total nirvana instead. Okay? And so we will be criticised for not solving the catastrophe that neoliberalism has left. So there's many, many things we'll propose which won't be easy. It'll be difficult, it'll be painful, and we'll be criticised for it. And one of those things I'll finish on speaking about this is that, of course, you can't, if you wanted to reduce the consumption humans are doing now to bring us within planetary boundaries, you would need to reduce average consumption by at least 50%, if not more. Now, if you impose that uniformly across society, then people who are already suffering from neoliberalism and the lack of provisions that means they get will be starving. And there'll be riots and the breakdown like we saw at the Arab Spring, when that was actually triggered by inflation for basic commodities, food and oil and so on. So you can't impose it on the poor, it must be imposed on the rich. And the only way you can do that, impose it on the rich, is to ration. Okay? You can't use the price system because they've got the money to pay the price system. If you quadruple the price of oil, they can still afford an intercontinental trip for lunch. Okay? We can't. So the only way to get out of this is intelligent rationing. And as part of that, I've been working on a proposal for a parallel currency using tradable universal carbon credits. There's one way we could do it. But if we don't do something like that, then we're not going to have a society to argue over. We'll have Mad Max instead.
Thank you very much. This was very nice to hear because we at the moment are advocating luxury consumption tax, which you just trashed. So thanks for that. But I understand the idea. However, we will have to think about changing the drum beat a little bit. However, what I think is important is that the short term and the long term are very strongly intertwined, which is what Kalecki, what Keynes was saying, that we cannot divide them and think, well, what is this investment that we will do? It's making short-term impact, and this is very important that you were saying that this is very much interconnected. However, we have a little bit more time, I think, so we can think about the long term a little bit more in what I would call a closing statements, and we could go by the reverse alphabetical order now, so Piotr will not have to be the first one again. So let's start by from Yulia, if you agree.
I'm going to make it sweet, and I'm going to bring it back to my most recent, most favorite economic scholar. Apologies, I really like your work. But specifically Elinor Ostrom, because I think she's one of the most underrated Nobel Prize winners, and actually a deserved Nobel Prize winner, not unlike many, or rather unlike many, because when we need to be thinking in systems, and I agree, Steve, with you and your work on this. So, and with the comment about how the immediate, midterm, and long term, it all needs to be interconnected. Is it complex? Is it messy? Is it a lot? Yes. So is everything. But it doesn't mean that we should be looking for shortcuts to how to solve problems. Some of the latest, circling back to Elinor Ostrom, she started working out polycentric systems, like what makes a resilient system. And she and her team worked out great ideas about what makes those systems. You know why? Because they observed what works and what didn't. They didn't speculate. They didn't make assumptions. They just studied what works and what doesn't. And towards the end of her career, she was working out something called socio-ecological systems. So they were looking beyond the commons and common pool resources, but at socio-ecological system. How do all the flows work together? And if we start thinking about every problem we see as an intricate, dialectically connected part of the whole, only then we can start getting to solutions. What Steve, also you referred to, was you need to include the energy. There is no such thing as externalities. There is no such thing as, one factor of production or whatever being independent from another. It doesn't work like that. Short term affects midterm, affects long term, and the other way around. That is the fundamental premise from which we shall start. And only then we can start making certain changes. I think that's going to be my thing.
Thank you very much. Katarzyna, now will be your turn.
Sure, thanks, Michael. And if we're thinking long term, I think the greatest challenge for us is climate change and respecting the planetary boundaries. Something you touched upon in your presentation. So. Well, Professor Mazzucato, who's always served as a great inspiration to me, would definitely not approve of me saying this, but we have an externality problem, and no mission-oriented approach is going to help us solve it. So in the long term, if we want to respect the planetary boundaries, what needs to happen, at least speaking from the fiscal policy point of view, is the inclusion of not only the real price of carbon, but also the real price of biodiversity loss, the plastic pollution, etc., in the cost of what we produce, both in terms of products and services. And this will certainly lead to some level of decoupling as it becomes more costly to transport goods all around the world, just to put one more part in it. and it will also likely lead to some level of degrowth, whether we like it or not, as we realize that our way of life, at least currently, is simply it's not something that our planet can bear. It's simply too costly for it. There are some similarities, now I think about it, to fighting inflation. So in a way, this whole thing, again, cannot be done at the expense of the most vulnerable people, local communities, workers, etc. So the way forward to me is finding mechanisms that will allow us to achieve that goal whilst also protecting them against the rising costs. We know that Canada is already experimenting with that for trying to return some of the carbon tax income to the most vulnerable. In a way, if you think about it, what the Polish government is considering doing with supporting, today the costs, the price of heating coal to protect those who need to heat their homes. It is in a way similar. Thinking long term, I think we should focus more on subsidizing things like the switching to cleaner and more reliable sources of energy. But in general, I think long term this should be the general direction.
Thank you very much. Now is the turn of Janina.
Thank you very much. I will probably continue my pension issues, but I would like to say that I agree that one of the biggest challenge for our society in the long term is, of course, climate change. And I also like the idea of degrowth, but as I said, we are living in the times of financialization and capitalism, so probably this idea needs more time to embed. So I think we should find a way to achieve growth without increasing environmental consequences, which is not easy, and we cannot prognose that because we don't know how the technological development will go on. So I will focus, as I said, on my field, and I will talk about the green transition, and I will tell that, in my opinion, green transition needs not only public but also private funds. And pension funds are a very important player in the market, and assets under management in global pension funds are equal to $50 trillion, which are, of course, invested in the long term. And that shows that the investment can really accelerate or mitigate the climate change and climate crisis. So my proposition in the situation in which we are living, as I said, financialization, privatization, and capitalism, is that we should really introduce a binding international regulation on sustainable investment of capital funds, including pension funds, which are huge, as I said. It's a very big amount of assets that we can redirect into better investments. And of course, we are already started to do it because in the European Union, we have this sustainable finance disclosure regulation. There are those discussion on taxonomy. I'm the member of the European states. I'm cooperating with European Insurance and Occupational Pension Authority, and we have right now discussion which will be in next month, the public consultation, whether gas and nuclear energy are sustainable or not, which shows how difficult it is. But it's easier to talk than to when I try to predict the future. So I'm not focusing on carbon taxes, progressive carbon tax or luxury taxes. I think that we really need regulations. And when we think about the change and the climate change and the climate crisis, we usually talk about and think about the fossil gas platforms, mining, but I think that we should really talk about banks, insurance, investors, institutional investors, but individual also in some extent. And we should do that because money is a driving force of climate change. And the most polluting sector, in my opinion, is not fossil fuels, it's finance. And this is why we should change this policy and really regulate on what they are investing. So my idea for the long term is guaranteeing pensions and invest those money into better world for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's finish with what Piotr has to say.
Okay, thank you. It's fun to be last, out of the, ordinary being the first one. Enough kidding around, but we started this conference on a discussion about the debt break within the Polish constitution and issues related to that. The Polish fiscal situation is quite good, actually, so we're not anywhere near crossing the debt. There was some threat of that in 2020 with the additional stimulus and help that the government and the taxpayer had to use to support the economy and the employees during that first pandemic wave. But this is the short term. And in the short term, fiscal rules within the European Union do not exist. Typically, and this is the Maastricht Treaty, fiscal rules are an important element of becoming the member of the Eurozone, sustaining the fiscal rules. We even had referendums in one country and tremendous international diplomatic wars with the Greek government because of fiscal rules and how the government uses them and how it decreases the deficit level during the debt crisis in the Eurozone. Currently, they do not exist. And for a period of time, probably they won't. It's, if I'm not mistaken, it's 2 years that we're still not going to use the fiscal rules on the EU level. So it's 60% to GDP. So it's not only the constitution in Poland, but it's also 3% of deficit and a way of going down by 1/20th of the debt level within 10 years, I guess, or something like that. So countries which are in debt as 200% or 120% to GDP would have to have a very fast track on decreasing the debt level in order to be in accordance with the fiscal rules. So basically, even before the pandemic, some of the rules did not apply to some of the members. So they kind of didn't exist before. And currently, before the pandemic, we had one element which we knew that needs a lot of investments, public investments, private investments, changes to the whole ecosystem. It's the climate-related issues and greening the economy, changing the energy mix within the European countries. Given its nuclear, gas as an intermediary solution going towards renewables, we had welfare-related issues, pension systems, social security as an important element, the second element of the trilemma, increasing, for example, family policy and expenditures in various European countries because of the baby bust and, not sufficient number of babies being born within the European Union. Currently, we have another element to the trilemma, especially in Central and Eastern European countries, which is security. And all the European countries, some of them are going to join NATO, as Sweden and Finland. Some of them are going to increase the expenditures on security-related issues, causing tensions on the fiscal side. And we have climate, security, and sustained welfare for the whole society as a big issue, probably, not allowing us to divide the cake as we wanted to pre-2008 or pre-2020, which also makes the discussion about the fiscal rules within the European Union and how to think about security-related expenditures and green-related expenditures, which some, as Sol Darvash or Guntram Wolf of Bruegel, think should be excluded of the fiscal rules on the EU level. I don't know. Basically it's the Germans who decide on the fiscal rules, and whatever they say is okay is being accepted by the European Union. Currently, they changed their constitution in order to have security-related issues excluded of the debt break, so of the deficit level that is being acceptable. within the constitution in Germany. So it might be so that in 2 years we're going to see the acceptance of security and army-related expenditures as being out of the equation on debt and fiscal-related rules that we have. And but this is not the last element of our problems, not the last element of the expenditures, additional expenditures that the state is going to have to have in the coming years, especially with the Polish Development Bank, which is servicing, for example, army expenditures too, as a development bank. So this discussion on public investment in the couple of years is going to be very heated in the European Union, and we see that the previous way of thinking on a lower level of deficits might not be sustained, given the challenges, the short-term challenges and long-term, because I don't know how fast the capacity of Russian army is going to increase in order to attack the Baltic states or Poland in the next couple of years. But we might fear the worst in the coming years and might expect that this might happen. So the security-related threat is quite imminent, and there's the element: is lower deficit really as important as having an army, or are welfare-related issues as important as having a sufficiently equipped army in a sustainable way in terms of the servicing of the debt, because the costs of servicing are also a bit bigger. I have to end.
Yeah, I have to be triply rude because in the beginning, by interrupting you, the second thing is you'll not be the last, and this is the second rude thing that I did, and it's connected to the third rude thing that I did, is that I skipped Steve. So Steve will be finishing the discussion, and after that, I have been given a permission for a very quick round of Q&A. So please think thoroughly if you want to ask it, if we want to wrap it up. Thank you.
Everybody's discussion about the long term so far was a continuation of the short terms. So, Russian conflict, budgets, etc., etc. I'm thinking long term on the other side of us realizing we're in a climate breakdown. And that long term, I think, has two potentials. It's either we end up in a world which the movies Mad Max covered very nicely, and I'd rather see that on screen than experience in real life, but I think that's quite possible. And the other is what states can actually manage to suppress our consumption sufficiently without falling apart. And even though I'm clearly an advocate of democracy and self-determination and so on, I think the states which are going to survive that breakdown best are the authoritarian ones. That particularly includes China, which I think has shown its capacity to fight off COVID far better than any other country, even though it's involved what would look like enormous human rights abuses to us. The end result of that is people in Shanghai are partying without masks because there is no COVID.
Currently, they're in lockdowns. They started it today.
No, they actually pulled out a lockdown 2 days ago. They might have gone back into it again. It's quite possible because it's such a virulent disease. But it's that level of acceptance of authoritarian rules which makes it possible to survive a crisis like that. And when you talk about having to reduce food consumption, for example, which I think will happen, then you're not going to do it if you impose that food restriction on the poor rather than the rich. So that's the long term that I see. I think we still believe we can continue the direction humanity's been on for the last quarter of a millennium, and we're probably 2 or 3 times over the level of consumption which is sustainable on the planet. So that's the real long term.
May I say one thing? Because the current, there are some elements to the Mad Max. If you want Mad Max to be in Russian or in English, and I prefer it to be in English, even if it's going to be Mad Max. And this is also an element of the dilemma that we have here.
So I was I was thinking that I will say that this panel was boring and we agreed on everything, but as you can see, there are some differences, and this is good. Let's hear what the audience wants to ask.
Oczywiście rozmowa o Mad Maxie przy kawie. Mamy 5-10 minut, idę tam z mikrofonem.
I would like to ask Professor Keane, could you explain why do you think that Paul Krugman is one of the neoclassical economists?
Read his resume. He was involved in a debate with an evolutionary biologist about 20 years ago, and he made the point that he strongly believes in optimization, minimization, marginal change, etc., etc. He's clearly neoclassical, and in some ways he's one of the worst of the neoclassicals because he's reasonable. And therefore he uses neoclassical reasoning to reach reasonably okay conclusions which exclude completely different attitudes and analysis that sometimes reaches the same conclusion he reaches by breaking neoclassical rules. So he's the one who excludes the progressives. And the same thing applied back in Keynes's time with John Hicks. John Hicks was an extremely intelligent man, a very good human being, who destroyed Keynes's revolution and dragged over the top the neoclassical way of thinking. His model of the ISLM is a Walrasian model, and he admitted that in 1981-82. So in that sense, it's the people who are reasonable, the progressives on the neoclassical side, who actually prevent the type of overthrows we see. If they were all like the loonies of the neoclassicals, the Sargents and the Wallaces and so on, we could have got rid of them a long time ago. He's definitely neoclassical.
Okay, please don't ask for Joseph Stiglitz, okay?
Thank you very much. I actually had a question from the United States perspective. If the deficit is due to ridiculously low tax revenues that we saw with our recent legislation versus spending, does that change at all the analysis that you were discussing and what that looks like?
Is that to me? Okay. Yeah. When you look at the accounting of tax and the accounting of spending, government taxation does not finance government spending. Government spending creates money. That's what finances its expenditure. And then taxation takes that money out of circulation because the level of government spending is at least 20% of GDP, 30%, 50% in some countries. If you're injecting that much money every year into the economy and not taking it back out again, you would have obviously Weimar Republic levels of inflation. So what taxation does is take out excessive amounts of money that were created by government spending. If you go back to the 1900s and so on, the level of government spending in America was about 5% of GDP. And you could spend 5% of GDP and not tax a lot of it back. It didn't matter. Now it does. So what we have had with the low levels of taxation is that whose bank accounts is the money being taken out of? And the answer to that is not Paul Krugman's and not Bill Gates's bank accounts. It's taken out of the middle class and the poor. So in that sense, income tax, which made a lot of sense as a way of taking out excessive money creation when it was first introduced I think actually before the Second World War, that would be better if we had transaction taxes, which actually brought that money back out of creation. So I think we're looking at, if you want to see taxation properly, it's an income redistribution element. It's not a government financing. And what's happened is we had a lame version of bringing that money out of circulation, which the rich are able to avoid and the poor can't. So therefore the burden is falling on the middle class and the poor, and that's why you've got the redneck supporters voting for people like Trump and so on, because all they see from the government is taking money out of their bank accounts. They don't see the government putting money in at the same time. So I think we need to reform our taxation systems, but not because we want the rich to finance government spending. We want the money to be taken out of the bank accounts of the rich as well as the poor, and income tax is not successful at doing that.
Thank you very much. I see Mateusz Piotrowski wants to ask a question.
I have a question to Yulia Yurchenko. Being very sympathetic to this idea of de-oligarchizing Europe, Ukraine. I have a practical question of governance, because even if this oligarchic money is nationalized in Ukraine, oligarchy is very much embedded not only in the private sector, but also in the public sector. Indeed, it's very hard to tell the difference. So in practical terms, what kind of governance instruments can be used to make this transparent, as you said?
Just to clarify, what specifically transparent? Who is an oligarch and who isn't? Or
just to clarify, say we implement your idea of seizing, nationalizing the oligarchic money. How do we make sure that it is used with public interest if oligarchs are already a big part of the government?
Yeah. So thank you very much. That's a very important question. So this is a question that requires a multi-level solution. So first of all, as long as we have international investor secrecy laws and ability to have shell companies and transfer pricing and hiding and moving money at nanoseconds around the world, it is not something that's very easy to do, because money, we need to be able to track where it's going if we want to be able to put it back where it belongs, which is one of the things that Professor Keane is also suggesting. So there is that kind of complication, of course. A lot of oligarchs, specifically in Ukraine, so that's why I talk about global oligarchy that needs to be put back into the straitjacket and maybe somewhere further away. But economic straitjacket, that is. I do not believe in corrective psychotherapy like they did in USSR. In Ukraine, one of the things that my political organization I'm part of, which is democratic socialist called Socialny Ruch, social movement. Some of you who are familiar with Razum would know that we're working together, especially more recently about debt cancellation. One of the points in our program is political lustration and economic lustration in the country, which means decoupling of business and politics. So oligarchs need to be kicked out of political power altogether. In Ukraine, who those oligarchs are is kind of relatively clear. And then the next thing to do is to make sure that there is no financing of MPs or buying votes in the parliament by oligarchs, which happens a lot. Right? So that kind of complex process of separating business and politics is something that needs to happen as part of de-oligarchization. And because a lot of, there are procedures already in Ukrainian legislation, and as part of the kind of the rules that are being adopted and have already been adopted and are still being implemented as part of this kind of association process with the EU, there are processes through which those who have accrued property, accrued assets through shady schemes can have those taken off them. That process can happen, right? So there is already infrastructure through which that de-oligarchization can happen. But just by setting up some certain, but just by saying that the state is corrupt because there are predatory politicians, corrupt politicians, which is what we often hear, and therefore everything that's state-owned needs to be privatized, which is also what Ukraine is being advertised. Well, we had the so-called privatization of Ukrtelecom, which is a kind of monopoly supplier of infrastructure, optical fiber cables, internet, and the rest of it. Whose hands did it end up in? Rinat Akhmetov. Some foreign company bought it, and then a bit later he bought it back. It's the biggest oligarch in Ukraine. So it's a complex process of transforming institutions, transforming priorities of government politics, and making the state and making this kind of processes of ownership and governance work for the society and not for individual oligarchs. But again, there is a lot of infrastructure that's already there, but political and economic lustration needs to happen, and not only in Ukraine.
Thank you very much.